Almighty God, by whom alone kings reign and princes decree justice, and from whom alone cometh all counsel, wisdom, and understanding. We, thine unworthy servants, here gathered together in thy name, do most humbly beseech thee to send down thy heavenly wisdom from above, to direct and guide us in all our consultations. And grant that, we having thy fear always before our eyes, and laying aside all private interests, prejudices, and partial affections, the result of all our counsels may be to the glory of thy blessed name, the maintenance of true religion and justice, the safety, honor, and happiness of the king, the public weal, peace and tranquility of the island, and the uniting and knitting together of the hearts of all persons and estates within the same, in true Christian love and charity, one towards another, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
You may be seated. This honorable House now resumes its sitting. It remains a great honor and privilege to welcome you all to the sitting of the Honorable House of Representatives for today, Tuesday, March 25, 2025. This is particularly for the conclusion of the 2025-2026 budget debate by the Honorable Minister of Finance and the Public Service. I would like to extend a special welcome to those who are special guests here in the gallery, most notably students from Mary C. Cole Hall at the University of the West Indies and members from the representing from the Ministry of Finance, and to all of those joining us online via the various social media platforms, PBCJ live stream, welcome to the Parliament. Call of the roll.
Mr. Clark. Here. Mr. Bartlett. Dr. Holness. Dr. Chang. Mrs. Williams. Ms. Grange. Mr. Mackenzie. Mr. Chuck. Mr. Vaz. Dr. Tufton, Mrs. Malahoo Fort, Mr. Green, Mr. Charles Jr., Mr. Matthew Samuda, Mr. Morgan, Mrs. Cuthbert Flynn, Mr. Main, Mr. Davis, Mr. Terry Long, Mr. Hutchinson, Mr. Witter, Dr. Dunn, Mr. Brown, Dr. Brown-Burke, Dr. Charles, Mr. Chin, Mr. Cousins, Ms. Crawford, Ms. Daly, Mrs. Dalrymple Filbert, Ms. Davis, Mr. Golding, Mr. Graham, Dr. Guy, Ms. Hamilton, Ms. Hannah, Mr. Enriquez, Mr. Henry, Mr. Hilton, Mr. Jackson, Mr. Lawrence, Ms. Lee, Mr. Miller, Mr. Montague, Ms. Morrison, Mrs. Nita Garvey, Mr. Paulwell, Mr. Phillips, Dr. Phillips, Mr. Robertson, Mr. Robinson, Mr. Carl Samuda, Mr. Shaw, Mr. Siblis, Mr. Slowly, Mr. Smith, Mrs. Vaz, Mr. Warmington, Dr. Wheatley, Mr. Williams, Mr. Wilson, and Mr. Wright. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
House Leader.
Madam Speaker, I'd like to join you in welcoming members to this very important sitting of the House today, when the primary activity will be the closing of the appropriations bill debate by the Minister of Finance and the Public Service. Madam Speaker, I wish also to join you in welcoming the members of the public that have joined us in the gallery, particularly those from the good constituency of Eastern St. Andrew, a constituency that I have more than a familiar relationship with. And of course, members from the University of the West Indies, particularly the Mary C. Cole Hall, who are here with us today, members of the media, and other support teams that are here. Madam Speaker, the agenda today, as I indicated, will primarily consist of some tidying up matters which the Minister of Finance has to do in regards to one or two items which she will do immediately ahead of her presentation, and then the closing. And again, we expect in the standard that she has set in her record-breaking performance last week, that she will continue in that vein today. May it please you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you, House Leader. Statement by ministers. Announcements.
Laid on the table of the House are the following: Annual Report of the National Health Fund for the financial year 2021-2022 and its Ministry Paper number 10 of 2025 entitled Annual Report of the National Health Fund for the financial year 2021-2022. Annual Report of the National Health Fund for the financial year 2022-2023 and its Ministry Paper number 11 of 2025 entitled Annual Report of the National Health Fund for the financial year 2022-2023. The General Consumption Tax Amendment of Schedules Order 2025 under the General Consumption Tax Act and under the Auditor General's Department Certified Appropriations Account, first head 42,035 at the Department of Government Chemists for the year 2020-2021, and under head 42,035, the Department of the Government Chemists again for the year 2021-2022, and head 72,000 at the Ministry of Local Government and Rural Development for the year 2022-2023.
Thank you. Bills brought from the Senate, petitions, papers, reports from committees, notices of motions given orally. Minister of Finance.
Madam Speaker, Madam Speaker, I beg to give notice that at the next meeting of the House, I will move to introduce and have read a first time a bill shortly entitled the Large-Scale Projects and Pioneer Industries Tax Relief Act 2025. Madam Speaker, I beg to give notice that at the next meeting of the House, I will move the following motion: the General Consumption Tax Act, the General Consumption Tax Amendment of Schedules, Order 2025 Resolution, whereas by virtue of Section 61 of the General Consumption Tax Act, hereinafter referred to as the Act, the Minister may, by order published in the Gazette, amend the schedules to the Act. And whereas the schedules to the Act specify the general consumption tax and the special consumption tax imposed on the supply in Jamaica or the importation into Jamaica of goods and services, and whereas on the 19th day of March 2025, the Minister made the General Consumption Tax Amendment of Schedules Order 2025, and whereas it is provided by Section 62 of the Act that an order amending the schedules to the Act shall be subject to affirmative resolution of the House of Representatives, and whereas it is desirable that the General Consumption Tax Amendment of Schedules Order 2025 be affirmed by resolution. Now, therefore, be it resolved by this Honorable House as follows. The resolution may be cited as the General Consumption Tax Amendment of Schedules Order 2025 resolution. The General Consumption Tax Amendment of Schedules Order 2025 is hereby affirmed. Madam Speaker, I further beg to give notice that at a later stage today, I will move for the suspension of the standing orders to enable me to take this motion.
Thank you, Minister. Questions and answers to questions. Motions that may be made at the commencement of public business requiring notice. Motions relating to the sitting of the House. Motions for leave to introduce bills. Presentation of bills without leave of the House. First obtained. Minister.
Madam Speaker, I now move for the suspension of the standing orders to enable me to take the motion, notice of which I gave earlier.
Members, the question is that the standing orders be suspended to allow the Minister to take first reading of the bill. Those in favor? Those against? The ayes have it. That is as it relates to large-scale projects and Pioneer Industries Tax Relief Act 2025.
Madam Speaker, I now move for the suspension of the standing orders to enable me to take the first reading of a bill shortly entitled the Large-Scale Projects and Pioneer Industries Tax Relief Act 2025.
A bill shortly entitled the Large-Scale Projects and Pioneer Industries Tax Relief Act 2025, read a first time.
Minister.
Madam Speaker, I now move that a bill shortly entitled the Large-Scale Projects and Pioneer Industries Tax Relief Act 2025 be read a first time. A second time, sorry, be read a second time.
So, Minister. Marshall, a moment, please.
Madam Speaker, I beg to give notice of second reading of the bill.
House Leader, Public Business.
The Minister will take the affirmative action resolution which she indicated earlier and then proceed thereafter to conclude the debate on the Appropriations Act. May it please you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you, House Leader. Minister.
Madam Speaker, I now move for the suspension of the standing orders to enable me to take the motion, notice of which I gave earlier.
So, Minister, if that's okay, I will take the general consumption tax. The question is that the standing orders be suspended to enable the Minister to take the motion, notice of which she gave earlier. Those in favor? Aye. Those against? The ayes have it.
Madam Speaker, the matter before us is the general consumption tax, amendment of Schedules Order 2025, and its resolution, which supports revenue measures for financial year 2024-2025, included in Ministry Paper number 11/24. The measures being proposed are aimed at bolstering the private security industry amidst the increase in targeted attacks on entities providing armored cash courier services, in addition to ensuring compliance with Jamaica's international trade obligations. Madam Speaker, I will give an overview of the measures. The first measure revises the tax structure for the importation of armored cash courier vehicles. Madam Speaker, the numerous gun attacks, ambush, and robbery attempts on the armored cash courier industry has negatively impacted the private security industry. These attacks have impacted the companies providing cash courier services by significantly increasing their operational risk and exposing frontline officers to harm. The attacks have also had a negative effect on the routine servicing of automated banking machines, hampering the delivery of cash to the general public. Madam Speaker, in an effort to facilitate investment in assets that are purpose-built for the transportation of cash and other values, the government has taken the decision to remove the GCT and SCT from armored vehicles and the added cost of armoring a vehicle. The details of the measures are as follows. The second schedule of the GCT Act is being amended to enable armored vehicles to be subject to special consumption tax, SCT, at a rate of 0%. This will apply to armored vehicles with a cost, insurance, and freight CIF value in excess of US $33,000 to be utilized in providing an armored cash courier service, and the added cost of armoring a vehicle, that is, to render the vehicle fit for use as an armored vehicle for the specific use as an approved cash courier. This Honorable House, Madam Speaker, is asked to note that Part 1 of the third schedule is being amended to exempt from GCT payment armored vehicles with a cost, insurance, and freight CIF value in excess of $33,000 to be utilized in providing armored cash courier services. Secondly, the amendment will also exempt the added cost of armoring a vehicle to render it fit for use as an armored vehicle imported for the specific use of providing armored cash courier services. Madam Speaker, the measure is intended to be temporary, and as such, the effective period for the relief is between April 1, 2024 to March 31, 2026. It is therefore being encouraged that entities engaged in the cash courier service utilize this period of GCT and SCT relief to upgrade their fleet and invest in purpose-built vehicles. Madam Speaker, I will now move to the second measure addressed by this order, which is the standardizing of Jamaica's general consumption tax GCT treatment on raw foodstuff. Madam Speaker, by virtue of Jamaica's membership to the World Trade Organization, WTO, the country is not allowed to implement internal tax measures designed to protect domestically produced products. The utilization of GCT, which is an internal tax currently charged on imported raw foodstuff, but not on locally produced raw foodstuff, could be interpreted as a measure that gives protection to domestically produced raw foodstuff. Madam Speaker, this is considered an uncompetitive practice from the perspective of international trade and Jamaica risks, at the very least, jeopardizing the relationships with its trading partners. In light of this, Madam Speaker, we are amending the third schedule of the GCT Act to equalize the tax treatment for both domestically produced and imported raw foodstuff. Therefore, both domestically produced and imported raw foodstuff will now be exempt from the payment of GCT. Madam Speaker, this amendment applies generally to the following items: fresh fruit and vegetables, ground provisions, legumes, onions and garlic, meat, chicken, fish, crustacean or mollusks, and corn. Madam Speaker, it should be noted that items previously not considered raw food and subject to GCT will continue to remain subject to the tax. Madam Speaker, although we are removing the GCT on imported raw food stuff, this Honorable House should note that the items in question still attract taxes, primarily common external tariff, CET, and additional stamp duty. The removal of the GCT on imported raw foodstuff preserves our international trading relationships by removing the risk that Jamaica will face trade sanctions from other member states as a result of the discriminatory treatment applied to imported raw foodstuff. In concluding, Madam Speaker, the measures included in this order aim to facilitate investment in the armored cash courier industry and to remove any unnecessary risk to our international trade profile due to distortionary GCT practices. The House is therefore being asked to approve the General Consumption Tax Amendment of Schedules Order 2025 resolution.
So, House Leader, response, is that? Member from St. Andrews Southeastern will respond.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. On the first measure, the opposition has no objection to it. We recognize the importance of cash in our society, and we're fully aware of the number of incidents where cash courier companies have been attacked, people have been killed, and the impact that that has had on the ability of banks to restock their ATM machines and ensure that there's adequate cash. So any measure which facilitates those companies having more armored trucks is certainly something that we would support, and we do. Madam Speaker, on the second measure, we do have concerns about the removal of GCT on imported raw food items. My first question to the Minister, can you indicate which countries, if any, raised an objection to this? And did these objections take place within the ambit of the World Trade Organization, which has a process to deal with objections of this nature? And if you could indicate where within the process that objection got to and whether there was a resolution. I raise this because the removal of GCT on imported items has the potential to negatively impact the local agricultural sector. Notwithstanding what anybody wants to say, we know that developed countries subsidize their agricultural industry to an extent that we don't, very heavily. And while I assume there was some pressure brought on the government to undertake this measure, we operate, trade operates within a rules-based environment. So I want to know who raised the objection, where within the WTO process we got to, what was Jamaica's defense, whether the advice taken to remove the GCT was something done in consultation with the AG's department and other stakeholders, because we don't have a level playing field in this world, and we don't want to undertake measures which will negatively impact our local industry. I know this was introduced by your predecessor. We raised the concerns then. There really wasn't any satisfactory answer provided as to why we were being forced to take this measure. But now that we're here, I would like some answers on that particular issue.
Minister, there is also a follow-up from the member from St. Catherine South, St. Catherine Southern.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Minister, I want to add my support to the relief regarding the armored vehicles. During the deliberations of the Economy and Production Committee, where we had the Bank of Jamaica present, the strong argument was made through the governor from the operators of the ATM machines about the enormous costs involved in adequately providing ATM machines across the country. And against the background of closures of many of the banks across the country, we have many communities in rural Jamaica who have to journey, I'm told by some members of parliament, up to 30 miles to get to an ATM machine. And even in the corporate area and other urban centers, a number of machines remain inoperative for extended periods of time, making it extremely difficult for citizens to access cash to make their transactions. Quite frankly, they appeal to the government for the support, and now that there's a response positively as it relates to the costs involved in providing these machines, we expect, and the country, because when the government gives these tax relief, it is the taxpayers of the country that make the sacrifice. And to the extent that the government is providing this relief, boy, oh boy. And therefore, Madam Speaker, the citizens expect that the banks will respond in a very positive way in making sure that our consumers have easier access to ATM machines against the enormous number of closures that they have implemented in recent times. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you, member. The leader of the opposition, the member from St. Andrew. So you'd have to turn off your mic. It's going to come next. Oh, okay. Member from St. Andrew Western.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I'd like to, first of all, I support the measures on the courier, and I want to adopt this sentiment attached by my colleague from St. Catherine South East. St. Catherine South. Madam Speaker, I want to address the situation as it regards the removal of GCT and agricultural item, including the listing contained in the resolution. Madam Speaker, I can hardly think of a worse time that we'd want to bring this resolution, because the rules in the WTO have been totally upended. The rules affecting trade in the WTO has been totally upended, creating an environment now where countries in developing countries are put at a distinct disadvantage, and small developing countries an even worse disadvantage. The reality is that the rules-based system we agreed to because there was some equity in it for the developing countries. That has now been turned on its head by current policies, trade policies, and measures being adopted by developed countries. In addition to the built-in subsidies and the blue box, green box, yellow box arrangements in agriculture, the imposition of tariff at this point of time has meant that any consideration that we may have had in terms of working with the rules to phase out some of these measures that we have imposed, I think we now have to consider that these are now protective measures in light of what is emerging, what is evolving in terms of trade policies in being imposed in developed countries. I believe, Madam Speaker, that the timing of this could not be any worse. It cannot be any worse because the impact on our local sector is real and damaging. And it further puts us at a disadvantage by this removal of the tariff at a time when tariff is being imposed. And not only tariff, my understanding is that it's tariff and other measures are being imposed. And so, Madam Speaker, I would strongly urge the Minister to reconsider this particular set of measures. Reconsider them because it will further put the agricultural sector at a further disadvantage. The timing of it is simply, we have yet to understand the full extent of the measures that are being proposed and what are the implications for our economy in general and the agricultural sector in particular. And I would ask and urge that it be deferred so that we have an opportunity to understand what are the evolving set of measures that are being imposed on us at this point of time. I strongly urge that as someone who participated in the WTO arrangement, negotiated Jamaica's accession to the WTO, the imbalances that will be imposed on us by these new fangled measures that are being imposed, I think need to be appreciated, studied, understood, and the impact assessed. I would urge that.
Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I too understand the need for the tax break, essentially, that's been given to our security companies bringing in the armored vehicles. We all know the terrible situation that has been faced by them with the multiple robberies of ATMs and of armored vehicles arriving to either deliver or remove cash. So I don't think anybody in the House would have an issue with that. I also want to endorse a concern raised by my colleague, the member for Western St. Andrew, in relation to the timing of the implementation of this amendment to the GCT Act, third schedule. As has been said, we are now in an era where measures including tariffs, but also not limited to tariffs, all sorts of measures affecting trade are being touted, being pushed, being considered, and it's a very unsettled environment because we don't know where it's all going to end. In the meantime, we are removing a protective measure that was in place for the benefit of local producers of food and exposing them to the loss of that protection. Yes, there may be other import duties and charges that the importers of these items will have to pay, but as has been said, it is well established that for some of our trading partners, there are heavy subsidies that their producers enjoy from the states in which those countries, those producers are producing those food items. So it's not a level playing field in terms of the cost structures that the various competing players have to contend with. And the removal of this at this time seems to me to be premature. And although it was announced in the budget debate a year ago, and it's only coming here now, it seems to me that much has changed since then in terms of the international environment concerning trade. And I think we would be well advised to wait to see how the dust settles before we rush to implement this permanently in our law. And I also endorse and would like to, and I would also like to endorse and look forward to hearing the answers to the questions as to how this particular measure originated. You know, who was bringing pressure against Jamaica on this issue? Which country or countries? Where did it reach in the WTO system? What was Jamaica's stance in relation to any proceedings, if any, that were brought in the WTO system? How were those proceedings or that complaint or complaints, how were they resolved? You know, all we heard was that these protective measures were being removed, but we've never had a satisfactory answer as to why this has happened. And I look forward to the answer to that. There's one other point I wish to make, Madam Speaker, and it is this. These measures are having retroactive effect. So the armored vehicles, the dispensation or the exemption, the zero rating, whatever it is, under the second schedule, which I assume is the SCT, and under the third schedule, the exemption under the third schedule, is taking effect from, in one instance, April 1, 2024, and in the other instance, July 1, 2024. Similarly, the exemption in relation to the raw foods, whether it be meats or vegetables, is taking effect July 1, 2024. Now, I have to ask, what is the situation in relation to the imports which have taken place up to this date, or up to the effective date of this order? Was GCT collected or not on these items? If GCT was not collected on these items, what was the legal basis for it not being collected? Because I'm not aware of any provisional collection of tax act orders coming here to, for approval to implement on a temporary basis these measures. Normally, under the provisional collection of tax act, the minister can vary a tax or levy a tax, but it lasts for a finite period of time and then expires unless it comes here and is approved by the House. No such orders have come in relation to this, to the best of my knowledge. So my question is, what was the situation in relation to these imports during the period from these dates, which they're the effective dates of the order, April 1 in some instances, July 1 in others from last year, up to the time of the effective date of this order. And this order is dated March 19th. And I believe it takes effect on that date, subject to being approved here affirmatively. So I want to know, was GCT collected on these imports in the intervening period? If the answer is yes, what was the, or if the answer is no, it was not collected, then what was the legal grounds or basis upon which it was not collected by customs at the wharf? And if it was collected, with this measure now taking effect retroactively, what is going to happen to the revenue that was collected? Are we now exposed to having to refund these people for the GCT that was paid on these imports? There's a lot to be answered in relation to this, Madam Speaker, and I look forward to hearing the responses, or perhaps we should suspend the debate of this measure to give some time to the Minister to look into these very important issues. I thank you, Madam Speaker.
Madam Speaker.
Minister Mike.
Madam Speaker, I ask the House to recall that the GCT measures were announced by the former Minister Clark as part of the revenue measures of 2024-25, and they were not made into law. It is my understanding as well, with regards to specific countries that object. I understand from our technical persons that all of this happened when Jamaica was doing the review of our trade policy, and this came up by the reviewer. Jamaica's trade policy was being reviewed by the WTO, and it was noted. It was not a specific country, but by way of the process of review. The UK and the EU asked that we correct all measures inconsistent with our WTO obligations, and this happened in 2024. It started, so it started, Madam Speaker, with the WTO reviewer in November of 2023, and UK and EU comments occurred in July, August of 2024. Madam Speaker, there are some other questions that the members asked. In order to get those responses, Madam Speaker, I'm going to ask that the debate be suspended until further notice. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Appreciated. Minister?
Speaker. Yeah? Yeah? You want to bully everybody, but that now work. The debate closed. Suspend. I'm going to ask for the suspension when you get it. Because it just asks for it.
Members, no.
So you can't stop and speak for you.
Members.
Our funds drop out today?
Members, the question is that the debate be suspended at this time. Those in favor? Those against? The ayes have it. Minister?
Madam Speaker, members, please. Madam Speaker, I now invite you to ask. Members, please. Members. Madam Speaker, I now invite you to ask the Minister of Finance and Planning and member for St. Andrew Eastern to close the debate on the Appropriations Act. May it please you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you, House Leader. The Honorable Fayval Williams, MP, Minister of Finance and the Public Service, will now close the debate.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, let me acknowledge our students from the Mary C. Cole Hall at the University of the West Indies. Let me acknowledge as well, they're in the gallery, all the members from my constituency of St. Andrew Eastern, and all my people them from Ty Dixon who are watching online. We have members of G2K here this afternoon as well in the gallery. Let me acknowledge Ms. Natasha Marzov, IDB Country Representative, Jamaica, who's in the gallery. My husband, who is traveling, but I know he's watching online. I want to acknowledge him as well. All my colleagues here in the House, my friends and family, my counselor from St. Andrew Eastern, members of the media, thank you, as always, for carrying the good news about this government. Madam Speaker, I want to pause to acknowledge the media persons who traveled over hills and valleys to go to Ty Dixon to check out the district where we come from. And to write a nice article about Ty Dixon and me. Madam Speaker, I hope all the media persons who went to Ty Dixon stopped for a moment on their way there or back to enjoy the beauty of the Worthy Park Sugar Estate located in the plains of the Vale of Loidas. With its unending acres of sugarcane as far into the horizon as you can look. Madam Speaker, the scenes have always held me in awe from my childhood days until now. But Madam Speaker, there are other memories. In my childhood, many hardworking men from Ty Dixon would wake up before cock crows and walk the 5 miles in the wee hours of the morning from Ty Dixon to Worthy Park Sugar Estate to cut sugar cane in the boiling hot sun with them cutlass. Many women did the same journey as well, but to pick oranges. At that time, there were thriving orange groves. So thank you to the media for your visit to Ty Dixon. The people them when we grow up with said them love the attention. Additionally, your social media post highlighted and reminded me that my mother used to sell cornmeal pudding and potato pudding under a tree to school children at Ty Dixon Primary School. Madam Speaker, with the little my mother made from selling cornmeal and potato pudding, she would faithfully put aside something no matter how small. And it was that faithful putting aside of a little of the money she earned from selling cornmeal and potato pudding that allowed her to buy our school uniforms and a pair of Batter Shoe Store crepe, they call them sneakers nowadays, for each of us children every year, so that we did not have to walk barefooted to school and we did not have to wear the washed out, faded out uniforms. Madam Speaker, it is the experience of putting aside something, no matter how small, that still lives on in me. Madam Speaker, it's not where you begin, it's where you end. Yes. And I want to thank Mr. Vegas and others in social media who understood the message of 1-1 cocoa full basket. Rome was not built in a day. Take your hand, make fashion, who stood up in social media against the nonsense videos about $2,000 Pro Box. Madam Speaker, let me caution the opposition and their supporters about how they talk about Pro Box. Currently, there are 23,423 Pro Box vehicle owners in Jamaica. So be very careful that you don't disrespect Pro Box. Be very careful. Be very careful. Be very careful that you don't disrespect Pro Box, which is made by Toyota, the largest car manufacturer in the world.
Minister, it would appear that the members would like to be here until 9 o'clock tonight.
Madam Speaker.
Please allow the minister to present uninterrupted.
Madam Speaker, it is a vehicle that has been around for 20 years and has been a resounding commercial success for Toyota. It is fuel efficient and has very good aftermarket value. So be careful how you speak about Pro Box. Madam Speaker, it's not where you begin, it's where you end. It's not where you start, it's where you finish. Madam Speaker, we've come to the closing hour of the budget debate for fiscal year 2025-26. Madam Speaker, our Prime Minister, the teacher, the professor, the builder, has given us a history lesson that should be required reading for all of us so that we do not repeat the failed policies of the opposition, not the experiment with democratic socialism where everything is owned by government, not the hyperinflation years of 1973 to 1991 with inflation ballooning to 80%, not FinSoc that cost us US $3.4 billion, not the freeing up of the foreign exchange market without adequate foreign currency reserves. Madam Speaker, those are only some of the failed policies when the opposition was in government that are still reverberating today, meaning the impact of the failed policies are continuing and still have serious negative effects. Madam Speaker, we're not making excuses. These failures are hard for our economy to overcome. They are the equivalent of putting 100-pound weights on our athletes and saying to them, run and win gold medals in champs and the Olympics. Impossible, Madam Speaker. So, Madam Speaker, when we remind people about history and the failed policies of the opposition when they were in government, it is to help them to understand that we have not totally freed our economy of the drag on GDP growth that those failed policies still have up to today. Madam Speaker, if we did not have FinSAC deal to deal with, think of how much better off we would be as a country. Think of all the resources we would have at our disposal to invest in economic growth. Madam Speaker, the Prime Minister has made the National Housing Trust a big part of his growth agenda that will continue to bring decent housing to all who are in need. Madam Speaker, my one word for the Prime Minister's presentation is brilliant. From beginning to end, brilliant. Madam Speaker, the spokesman on finance put forward promises. Madam Speaker, the spokesman on finance put forward promises, but no costing. The leader of the opposition put forward more promises as well, but no costing. They also came with their recounting of history. Sadly, Madam Speaker, it did not include FinSAC and the long-lasting drag that the homegrown financial sector collapse has had on the Jamaican economy, even to this day. Madam Speaker, in both of their speeches, not a word was said about FinSAC, not an apology, not an acknowledgement. It was as if FinSAC never happened. Madam Speaker, Madam Speaker, Madam Speaker,
Members,
Madam Speaker, the leader of the opposition spent a lot of time talking about the NHT. The first proclamation he made is that he will stop the annual extraction of the 11.4 billion from NHT to fund the budget. He said he would set aside 1% of food import tax, which would be 2.5 billion per annum. He promised employers an increase in the employer tax credit to 40% from 30%. He went to town, Madam Speaker, decrying securitization. Right? The government is taking future revenues today, All told, between opposition leader and spokesman, they made promises upon promises upon promises. But did they give the Jamaican people any idea of how much those promises would cost? And whether or not that they would have to cut back on something to do what they're promising? No. They said they are united with fresh ideas and solid plans, ready. But let's see if indeed that would be the case. Madam Speaker, allow me, Madam Speaker, to demonstrate to the people of Jamaica that the promises from the opposition would create FinSAC 2.0. You see, Madam Speaker, the opposition put forward a lot of words with few figures. But within all those pages and pages and pages of words is a budget, an implied budget, Madam Speaker. And it is that implied budget that I would like all Jamaicans to understand, because it has serious negative ramifications for our future. So, Madam Speaker, let's begin. I will lay out, side by side, the central government's budget for fiscal year 2025-26 and the opposition's implied budget for that fiscal year as well. These are the headings, starting with chart number 1. Yes.
Fictitious.
Madam Speaker, I rise. Yeah. Madam Speaker, I rise on a point of order because the minister is misleading the House. We did not present an implied budget for the coming fiscal year. We presented our proposals, our policy commitments for the next PNP government. And we have never said that they will be implemented in the current fiscal year. They are... As has been said, the budget... After today, the budget would have been passed for the fiscal year. Our proposals represent what we will be doing for the duration of our first term in office. And that is what we were saying. And they will all operate within the current fiscal rules. Stop misleading the House.
We are misleading. Dismiss it. That is no point of order. Turn on our mic. A point of disorder. Julia. Julia.
Minister, you may sit for a little until the House is ready.
One cousin, relax on the speaker rule, you know. What? You can't run from this, you know.
Members, let me remind you, the public is hearing nothing of this discourse. Nothing of this discourse. If you're not on the mic, you're not being heard. So could we allow the Minister of Finance to conclude or to close the debate? Minister of Finance.
Madam Speaker, this is a budget debate. And anything you put forward has fiscal implications. So, Madam Speaker, because I was interrupted, let me start again. Madam Speaker, allow me to demonstrate to the people of Jamaica that the promises from the opposition will create FinSAC 2.0. You see, Madam Speaker, the opposition put forward a lot of words with few figures, but within all those pages and pages and pages of words is a budget, an implied budget. Madam Speaker, they did not put forward, Madam Speaker, they did not put forward an explicit budget, but they put forward ideas, and those ideas can be costed, and they should have been costed and made into a budget. So, Madam Speaker, let us begin. Again, I will lay out side by side with the central government's budget for fiscal year 2025-26 and the opposition's implied budget for the fiscal year 2025-26 as well. So, Madam Speaker, as I indicated last week, the tax revenue that the central government is projecting, Madam Speaker, I do need some protection from the noisy gallery over there. Madam Speaker, as I indicated last week, the tax revenue that the central government is projecting for fiscal year 25-26 is $994,494,000,000. This is represented on the screen, chart number 2. The opposition did not have any objection to that figure. They didn't put forward any opinion as to whether or not that revenue figure is too high or too low. So I am taking that as an implied acceptance. And so I will give them on their side of the ledger $949,494,000,000 in their column as well. Our tax revenues represent a 5.9% increase over what we collected for fiscal year 2024-25. That is coming to a close. That's a little bit above inflation, no wild assumptions, plus, Madam Speaker, we already subtracted all the give-ups in that figure. It's not to come. We took it out of the revenue projections already. And that cost was $9.2 billion. That's the cost of the good news that we presented, yes. So, Madam Speaker, I'm going to add that back to the opposition's column because, to be fair, those were our give-ups, not theirs, right? So we're going to put it back there. Right, right, those are, right, so we put it back. We put it back on their side of the ledger, right? Yes. So in the next chart, we move on to the next line item in the budget, non-tax revenues. These non-tax revenues, Madam Speaker, they include the 11.4 billion from NHT. They include asset sales, any share sales, for example, Trans-Jamaica. This is also where we put distributions from public bodies. And this would be where we have securitizations. They don't like that, so they can't get it. No, Madam Speaker, do you remember how the opposition leader declared that he would stop extracting the 11.4 from NHT and that securitization is us taking revenues from the future to spend in the present and something about, and you know, yes. Well, Madam Speaker, we cannot put any revenues from that in their column. Right, nothing. We would offend them if we did. So nothing there, Madam Speaker. So we move on to the next, item, the bauxite levy. Madam Speaker, we are projecting to receive $812 million in bauxite levy. And we will put that same amount, bauxite levy, on their side of the ledger as well. I know the opposition loves bauxite levy. They may even want to increase this number in their explicit, not their implied, their explicit budget. Yes. Because it was Michael Manley-led government who, after all, took on the transnational bauxite companies and imposed the 1974 bauxite levy. So they have a history with levies. As the history was written, Madam Speaker, in May 1974, Prime Minister Manley announced that Jamaica would repeal previous agreements Madam Speaker, as the history was written, in May 1974, Prime Minister Michael Manley announced that Jamaica would repeal previous agreements with the bauxite companies and impose a production levy on all bauxite either exported from or processed in Jamaica. Madam Speaker, anyone can read the history books about how that turned out. Revere Bauxite Company closed its shutters little more than a year later on August 19, 1975. Reynolds folded and left Jamaica in 1984. Alcoa also temporarily closed its gates in Clarendon on February 6, 1985. Yes, Madam Speaker. Yes, Madam Speaker. Jamaica did get increased earnings from the bauxite levy, which went from US $19.2 million in 1973 to a whopping US $180 million in 1974. But, Madam Speaker, the levy also moved the cost of Jamaican bauxite from being the cheapest to the most expensive worldwide. In an article entitled "The Bauxite Levy 40 Years On, Who Let the Puss Out of the Bag?" the author quoted Dr. Davis and economist Dennis Morrison as saying that Jamaica has little to show from the bauxite levy, and that the country suffered through ill-fated projects and misspending of the bauxite levy funds, which were lodged to the Capital Development Fund. The upshot of all of this, Madam Speaker, is that bauxite companies began increasing their investments, not in Jamaica, in other bauxite-producing countries, and Jamaica consequently lost its position near the top of the ratings as a world-leading producer. Another failed policy of the opposition. And as the bauxite left Jamaica, so did high-paying jobs. The opposition spokesman has some nerve, Madam Speaker, talking about low-paying jobs now. It's your government failed policy that sent the high-paying jobs in the bauxite industry packing. But, Madam Speaker, I digressed. Let me get back to the implied budget of the opposition. All right, so the next line item is capital revenue. We are phasing out this line, so there is no money there because it's incorporated elsewhere in the budget. So we move on to the next line, which is grants. We're projecting to receive $5.9 billion, call it $6 billion in grants. We will put that on the ledger of the opposition as well. So those are the revenue items, Madam Speaker. On our side, we expect to see revenue and grants of $1 trillion, $96 billion, and $83 million. On the opposition side of the ledger, they have an implied budget of an implied revenue of $965 billion, $443 million, because they don't want any securitization or NHD contribution or other non-recurring revenues. They especially don't like securitization. And they figure, Madam Speaker, if they speak badly against securitization over and over and over and over again, Jamaicans will begin to think it's a bad thing, because after all, the leader of the opposition was a partner in a very big financial sector company, and so he must know a thing or two about securitization. And if he says he doesn't like securitization, then Jamaicans probably would conclude that something is wrong with securitization. But I want to say to Jamaicans, there is nothing wrong with securitization. The global securitized market is massive, nearly US 13 trillion. Research shows that 73% of residential mortgage debt is funded by securitization. 16% of auto loans are funded by securitization. 27% of commercial real estate debt is funded by securitization. 7% of credit card debt is funded by securitization. 8% of student loans are funded by securitization. 40% of multifamily debt is funded by securitization. 1 trillion of corporate borrowing is funded by securitization. The securitization market, while having roots in the late 18th century, with debt securitization, was modernized with the structured financing of mortgage pools in the 1970s and has grown significantly since then. So, Madam Speaker, I believe the opposition leader can stop now trying to drum all the negatives into the heads of Jamaicans about securitization.
House Leader, the member's time for speaking has expired.
Madam Speaker, the member's time for speaking having been expired, I beg to move that the minister be granted sufficient time to allow for the completion of her presentation. May it please you, Madam Speaker.
Thanks, House Leader. The question is that the minister be allowed sufficient time to complete. Those in favor? Aye. Those against? The ayes have it. Minister.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, we now move to the costing of the give-ups, the promises the opposition announced. So, Madam Speaker, the spokesman on finance said that they would pay back the asset tax that is levied on the financial sector in 5 payments. So first, Madam Speaker, the spokesman on finance will have to stop taking the asset tax before he can start paying back for what was taken. Otherwise, he would never finish paying back.
Members.
A point of order. The member for South East St. Andrew said nothing about giving back asset tax. He talked about phasing out the tax over 5 years, not giving back the revenue already collected in 1 year. The minister is again misleading the House, and she must stop doing it. On securitization, I never said that securitization is in itself wrong. I said the use of the proceeds to fund the recurrent budget, using future revenue to meet today's expenses is what is wrong. And she's again misrepresenting the position.
So, Leader of the Opposition, members, please, Leader of the Opposition, I hope you will appreciate that this is not a cross debate. And members, I am ruling, and the ruling stands. So, Opposition Leader, you have been allowed the leeway to rise on a point of order twice to offer some clarification to what was said. Members, no, I don't think so. Please allow Minister to conclude. Members, Minister Williams.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. So, Madam Speaker, an estimate for the asset tax give-up would be $8,364 million, which we will minus of the revenues of the opposition side of the ledger. Additionally, the opposition said they would not require any corporate taxes from MSMEs for 3 years. Madam Speaker, that's a give-up of $11.4 billion. Not for 3 years, in the first year, Madam Speaker. So we take that off of their ledger as well. The opposition also said they would take 1% of the taxes on the food import bill to put into a fund, so that would not be available for the central government's budget. And their own estimate is $2.5 billion, so we have to minus that off on their side of the ledger. And I have no quarrel with that figure. The opposition also said that they would increase the employer tax credit from 30% to 40% of tax chargeable. The cost. So the cost of that, Madam Speaker, would be a give-up of $3.4 billion. So now if we take a tally, their revenues and grants would now be $939,859 million after all those give-ups. Madam Speaker, let's move on to the expense side of the ledger. So we are projecting that compensation of public sector workers, including pensions, wage negotiation, and items owed will be $495,799,000,000. I don't believe the opposition would want to meddle with this number, except to increase it if they believe they can. So I will put that figure on their side of the ledger as well, because we have to pay public sector workers. We get to the next line item under the expenses, recurrent programs. And for Jamaicans, recurrent programs are programs such as PATH, school feeding, Grand Store, 1009 schools, school transportation, books for schools, supplies for hospitals and health clinics, restorative justice programs, child diversion programs, Grand Gala and other independence celebrations, Know Your Numbers programs, trucking of water, subvention to our universities and teachers' colleges, subvention to NSWA for garbage collection, payment for streetlights, and so on. You get the gist of what is in this figure of $359.4 billion. And Madam Speaker, every dollar of it is already allocated to something. The notion that there is all this discretionary money is just that, a notion. Every dollar in the budget is allocated. The opposition would be free to look at these programs and decide which ones they're not doing or which ones they will cut back on because those are the only decisions that are available. So in the meantime, we put the $359.4 billion on the side of the ledger for the opposition as well. So we move to capital spending. We're estimating that we will spend $62.6 billion, Madam Speaker. We would love to spend more, but we have to work within a budget. And I will use the same figure for the opposition. If they want to cut it, keep it, or increase it, that's their prerogative. So we come to another tallying point. You will notice, Madam Speaker, on the government side, after paying public sector workers and recurrent and capital programs, not including interest on the debt and amortization, we have $178,313,000,000 left. The opposition has $22,088,000,000 left. But wait, Madam Speaker, there is still a long list of other goodies that the opposition promised. Yes, yes. The opposition promised to raise standards in early childhood and primary schools. There was no costing associated with this, but I would expect that they wouldn't spend any less than $1 billion. The opposition promised a daily lunch meal at primary and secondary for all children who need it. Madam Speaker, the government currently spends $9 billion for 200,000 children to get a breakfast, snack, and/or a midday meal. So it sounds like the opposition would want to at least double this to 400,000 children. All right, and so that would cost them an additional $9 billion. The opposition also promised a daily breakfast, but they said thereafter. And so I take that to mean in the next fiscal year, so I don't have anything projected there for that. Yes. Madam Speaker, the opposition promised transport subsidy for 50,000 students over 3 years. In this upcoming fiscal 2025-26, that would cost an additional $428 million, just using the current figures for the 7,500 children for whom the government provides transportation. The opposition also promised to increase funding for special needs, but no one knows how much. And so I don't think that they would want to invest less than $1 billion in our special needs students. So there it is. Then electricity. They too want to tackle energy poverty and put renewable grid in communities, among other things. No cost was associated with this, but I'm going to put $2 billion because when we announced our $1 billion prepaid meter, house wiring and inspection, and $4,000 credit per month program, the opposition said it was not enough. Right? So add another billion, right? Okay. Madam Speaker, the opposition explicitly said that they would give $1 billion to the creative industry. So that is on the side of their ledger as well. Now this one, Madam Speaker, one full scholarship for a university degree per family. Madam Speaker, I had to get out my Excel spreadsheet to do this one. And so if you'll put the chart up for the one full scholarship per family. So, Madam Speaker, the number of households in Jamaica are, well, it's 967,000. And when you read the literature, household is used as a proxy for families. So you can assume, you can correctly use this as 967,000 families in Jamaica. The number of students graduating from high school yearly is 35,000 students. And when you compare 35,000 to 967,000, you can pretty much see that there's a student coming from, families all across Jamaica. So, Madam Speaker, I made the assumption that the cost of tertiary per year is $900,000. I am sure I am underestimating. I am sure I am underestimating the cost of tertiary. But anyways, Madam Speaker, every student graduating from high school would want a full scholarship.
It's all right.
Yes. And if you just take those figures, 900,000 times 35,000 students, because there's no student that's going to go to student loan to go get a loan, not when they can get a full scholarship, or they can get a full scholarship per family. Well, we have 967,000 families in Jamaica, so you must can get 35,000 one from them. And so, Mr. Speaker, when you take that and do the multiplication. You know, other than saying one per family, Madam Speaker, there were no other stipulations, nothing. It was a blanket statement. It just said one per family. That was it. When the Prime Minister at our party's conference in November last year, when he announced that he was going to give $20,000 to persons who were not, collecting any benefit from the government, he gave conditions. He said that they would have to be registered at the Ministry of Labor and Social Security, who would vet them, and so on. So he gave conditions. There were no conditions other than one per family to this promise. So, Madam Speaker, I did this calculation more than once. I did it more than once to assure myself that it was correct. You're talking about $31.5 billion annually, Madam Speaker. The opposition also promised to match the cost that companies invest in their employees. And again, Madam Speaker, you can do the calculation there because the data exists. On average, employers pay about $954 per worker. Average training hours, 57 for the year. We know what the employed labor force is, and we can, just take a percentage of that gets trained annually, maybe about 7% or so. The total spend on training would be about $5.1 billion. And since the opposition would fund 50%, that's $2.6 billion. The opposition said that they would match. Match means you give the companies money. Where would they get the money from? Isn't it the consolidated fund to invest in their employees? I don't know if they didn't know what match meant. But if I was an employer and the government says that they're going to match what I spend, I'd be expecting a check from the government. Okay. All right, so that's $2.6 billion, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, the opposition also said that they would remove all taxes on laptops and tablets for students and teachers. Madam Speaker, I'm not one to boast, but this government, this Prime Minister Andrew Holness-led government, has invested $8.2 billion in tablets, laptops, interactive panels, projectors, specialized equipment for special needs schools. And Madam Speaker, at least $1 billion is committed annually towards funding our technology in education policy. It's targeted at people who need it. The opposition leader said they will negotiate package deals to provide teachers with free internet service as a tool of their trade. Madam Speaker, this government provides laptops, tablets, and other devices for students, teachers, and classrooms. Since COVID 2020, this government has issued out, free of cost, to students, teachers, and installed in classrooms, 198,323 laptops, tablets, interactive panels, projectors, specialized equipment since we have been in government. Madam Speaker, since 2020, we've been rolling out broadband internet service to schools at no cost to parents or teachers or students. As of today, about 680 schools have free Wi-Fi inside and outside of classrooms. And when we're done, every school will have Wi-Fi inside and outside. That's not a promise. That's a commitment. And we back it up with an annual allocation year in, year out. And oh yes, Madam Speaker, how could I forget? We have 379 community Wi-Fis or hotspots right across Jamaica. At the last count, the Social Development Commission, the SDC, the principal community organization agency working with communities, said there are 775 communities across Jamaica. So, Madam Speaker, if my math is right, that puts this Dr. Andrew Holness-led government at 49% of communities across Jamaica with community Wi-Fis. Never before in the history of Jamaica has this happened. So, Madam Speaker, the bottom line, the PNP's promises, and I didn't even take all of them into consideration, is $48.8 billion. $48.8 billion. So, Madam Speaker, let's do another subtotal. On the government side, after all of that, we would be left with, no, go back to the next chart, the prior chart, please. 178 billion 533 mil, hold on, sorry, 300, okay, yep, 178 billion 313 million. They would be left with a deficit of $26 billion. $26.7 billion. Madam Speaker, they would have trampled on the fiscal rules. The same one they told us that they codified in law. Well, Madam Speaker, you don't see red ink yet. I didn't bring in the interest payment yet. We have an obligation to pay $177.533 billion of interest payment. That is immovable. On the government side, we can make the interest payment, and we have $780 million left as a positive fiscal balance surplus. A small one, as I said when I opened the debate, but a surplus. And it sure beats the many years of deficit spending, that the opposition had when they were in government. Importantly, Madam Speaker, with our budget, we can go to the financial markets and borrow to refinance the $162,746,000,000 of debt that will come due during the upcoming fiscal year. We project that we will be able to borrow a little less than what is coming due. On the opposition side, Madam Speaker, their implied budget cannot meet the interest payment. They would run a huge budget deficit of some $204 billion. Madam Speaker, the opposition went partying with the rent money. Madam Speaker, if they cannot make the interest payment, they certainly cannot go to the financial market to refinance the $162,746,000,000 of debt that is due. The fiscal deficit that the opposition would run with all the give-ups and goodies violate the fiscal rule. It would send a shockwave into the financial markets. Those with money would run to convert their Jamaican dollars to US dollars. The dollar would fly. Interest rates would go sky high. Bond prices would tumble. The balance sheets of the financial sector would be severely weakened instantaneously because they have large holdings in Government of Jamaica bonds, and much of the bonds would be marked to market, meaning the financial sector would have to write down the value of their bond holding. Within no time, Madam Speaker, the Bank of Jamaica would have to hike interest rates to try to slow down capital flight. Madam Speaker, I am not exaggerating. It would be FinSAC 2.0. Madam Speaker, with the budget that we've put forward, we can go to market, to the financial market, and borrow to pay off the same amount of debt. It's called rollover. We can do that because investors trust our budget. The Independent Fiscal Commission said our budget is credible and our budget is sustainable. We have indicated strongly by our numbers that we've put to the public, to Jamaicans, that we will not run with it in an election year. And we put forward a budget that, when subject to interrogation, is not a run-with-it budget by any stretch of the imagination. Madam Speaker, would we want to give everybody more? Of course. We would have loved to announce that Jamaicans would get the threshold up to $2 million in 1 year, and that we're going to help 40,000 people instead of 20,000 to get their prepaid meters, and that we have a longer period for the accelerated capital allowance, and that the funds to DBJ would be 10 billion rather than 2 billion. We would have loved to make these announcements, Madam Speaker, but we know that they would only feel good for a moment, and then the swift pain of a budget deficit would follow. And so, Madam Speaker, we remained faithful to our commitment that we would continue fiscal prudence. That we would continue fiscal prudence despite this being an election year with its many demands. And so I say to the opposition leader, and spokesman on finance, get off your high horse about securitization. Call up NHT and tell them that you still really need that $4.4 billion. And the no corporate income tax for MSMEs, you should personally call up the head of the MSME Alliance and apologize for getting their hopes up, because you will not be able to do the 0% corporate income tax for 3 years. And then there's the 1% of food import tax and the employer tax credit. That is not going to happen either. So, Madam Speaker, I believe we have given the implied budget of the opposition a thorough interrogation, and the 2 words that I have for the implied budget of the opposition are the following: not credible. If the opposition wants to refute this claim that their implied budget is not credible, then let them put forward a budget that can be interrogated. And Madam Speaker, you will note, Madam Speaker, that I did not even ask the opposition how they're going to implement the flat rate for water without bankrupting NWC. I've seen many creative ideas in social media about what persons would do to access the flat rate. But Madam Speaker, I will leave that for now. This I do know, Madam Speaker. The Jamaican people deserve more than promises and half-baked ideas. They deserve more than promises and half-baked ideas without the rigor of costings. As a country, as a people, we have matured in our thinking, Madam Speaker. And if it was not our parents or grandparents' thinking that have matured, it's the thinking of their children and their grandchildren and great-grandchildren that has matured and to which they have the benefit. And so I say to the opposition, Jamaicans deserve answers as to what kind of a budget the opposition would have in an election year. Madam Speaker, the opposition does not have to tell us right now in Parliament about their budget. They can think about it, Madam Speaker. The opposition does not even have to tell us next week or the following week. They can take their time, Madam Speaker. But, Madam Speaker, they sure need to tell the Jamaican people what are the numbers in their budget before the polls open on election day, whenever that day is, Madam Speaker. So, Madam Speaker, I say to the Jamaican people, it's decision time. You have seen us work on your behalf since February of 2016. We're not perfect, and we don't always do the right things all the time, but we have a leader, a prime minister, who has a good heart. He comes from among you. Born and lived in a board house in Spanish Town. He comes from among you. The Prime Minister He comes from among you. Born and lived in a board house in Spanish Town. Do you ever wonder why he personally goes out and hand out the keys for the social houses built of block and steel? Even though, Madam Speaker, there's so many other demands on his time, it's because he does not want another little Jamaican boy or girl to grow up in a board house and run the risk of being teased by another little Jamaican boy or girl who would say, "Abe, you and your mother live in a board house." He wants families to be able to hold up their head about their living conditions. No big unfinished Operation Pride schemes without proper sanitation. No big unfinished Operation Pride schemes without proper sanitation. Madam Speaker, as I close, I want the MSMEs to know that we would be delighted to have their representative at the table as we deliberate on the micro market. I also got a word from the DBJ as well, Madam Speaker. They sent me a letter to say to the MSMEs that their loan fee financing for improved MSME access to credit products is designed to enhance financial accessibility and affordability for micro, small, and medium enterprises by eliminating the barrier of upfront loan-related fees. And so the DBJ is saying that they will integrate the loan fees into the principal loan amount, allowing borrowers to distribute these costs over the loan tenure instead of making an upfront payment. Madam Speaker, for all those who have written and have asked, Madam Speaker, for all those who have written and have asked about the cost of our package that we announced, or give up, or good news, it is $9.2 billion, and it is already accounted for in our budget. Madam Speaker, Madam Speaker, Jamaicans do not want a government that will party with the rent money, as the implied budget of the opposition has shown. You can be assured, that we will continue to be good stewards of the country's resources. And so, Madam Speaker, I say to all Jamaicans, it's decision time. And as you weigh us in the balance, may you find us faithful. Madam Speaker, all that we are and everything we have resulted from our humble beginnings. One from the board house in Spanish Town, and one from Ty Dixon, who used to carry water on her head with a cutter and walk to school barefooted many times. All that we are and all that we have, we owe it to Jamaica. have no other place to go, Madam Speaker. And so I say again to all Jamaicans, it's decision time. Whom do you trust with your future? Do you trust those who don't know what the financial cost of all the things they have promised? Or if they know, they still put forward an implied budget that is not sustainable and not credible? An implied budget that would cause another FinSac. Whom do you trust with your future? It's decision.
No members. Members.
So as I close, Madam Speaker, I say to all Jamaicans, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord cause his face to shine upon you and be gracious unto you. May the Lord turn his face towards you and give you peace. God bless Jamaica, land we love. We choose Jamaica. Thank you.
Very good.
My girl. My girl, my girl.
Members, one behavior, both sides.
Madam Speaker.
Members, Minister Williams still has something more before concluding.
Madam
Just allow her
Speaker,
to finish.
As we conclude the debate, I ask that the bill shortly entitled the Appropriation Act 2025 be read a second time.
The question is that the bill shortly entitled the Appropriations Act 2025 be read a second time. Clerk? Those in favor? Aye. Those against? The ayes have it. Clerk?
An act to apply a sum out of the consolidated fund to service of the year ending on the 31st day of March 2026 and to appropriate the sums granted in this session of Parliament read a second time.
The House will now resolve itself into a committee of the whole House to consider the bill clause by clause. Marshal. Thank you, Marshal. Members, please. I put clauses 1 through 3. Those in favor? Aye. Those against? The ayes have it. I put the schedule, sections 2 and 3. Those in favor? Aye. Those against? The ayes have it. I put the title and enacting clause. Those in favor? Aye. Those against? The ayes have it. Members, the question is that I do report the bill as having passed committee stage without amendments. Those in favor? Aye.
Madam Speaker, I now ask that the bill be read a third time.
Okay, so Minister, just one small item. We're back in the House, I do report the bill as having passed committee stage. And clerk, we'll just continue. The minister has asked that the bill be read a third time. Those in favor? Aye. Those against? The ayes have it. Clerk.
An act to apply a sum out of the consolidated fund to service of the year ending on the 31st day of March 2026 and to appropriate the sums granted in this session of Parliament, read for a third time and passed.
In my short stint in Parliament, only some 8 going 9 years, I've always wanted to see a balancing of the budget recommended by the opposition. House Leader.
Madam Speaker, it is really satisfying to note that you have at least realized that in your 9th year. And as a matter of fact, Madam Speaker, it's perhaps one of the first times that we have seen a technical presentation in the closing of a budget, where everybody can watch and see and understand. And Madam Speaker, if there's any doubt in anyone's mind as to the veracity of what has been presented, the hard information presented has made the point and made it very well indeed. So, Madam Speaker, we have come to the end of perhaps the best budget debate that I have experienced, certainly as a member of this House. And we've been here in this House a little while. Member Samuda, and I call your name not in breach of the standing orders at all, but in reference to your years of service to this honorable House, as perhaps the longest serving member of Parliament anywhere in the Caribbean. Yes, but he isn't here. He isn't here at the moment. But I would because I'm sure he's watching and listening, I would certainly enjoin my Honorable Michael Lester Henry in this regard. And or Lister, not Lester, Lister. He's very careful about that. And I know, Madam Speaker, because we're of the same vintage, not in terms of chronology, but in terms of years in this honorable House and in the public space. As I entered this chamber in 1980, just as those two, I had a small sabbatical, but I came back. And so after those two, then the member from St. Elizabeth, Northwestern, where is he? And myself stand as the next two for the longest serving in this honorable House. And we are saying today that this is the best budget presentations that we have had ever since we are here. And indeed, Madam Speaker, it is appropriate that we should end the presentation in the way we did as loyal, committed patriots. To reinforce the simple fact that we choose Jamaica. Madam Speaker, I beg to move, therefore, that the motion for the commencement and indeed the conclusion of the debate on the appropriations bill be approved.
Those in favor? I had approved that already. And those against, the ayes have it. Adjournment.
Speaker, it is customary, in fact, to close in that manner, as is accepted. Once a motion has been put, that motion has been approved. Madam Speaker, is not intended to do any further business for the House today. I therefore move for the adjournment of the House until Tuesday. Madam Speaker, I particularly want to ensure that we have a continuation of the debate today. because there are measures there that are important to be settled. And so in asking for the adjournment, for the first, I'm cautious about the 1st of April. It's actually, I'm cautious about the 1st of April. But, Madam Speaker, I beg to move that the House be adjourned until Tuesday, April 1, 2025, at 2 p.m. at the George William Gordon House. May it please you, Madam Speaker.
The question is that the House do now adjourn until the 1st of April, 2025 at 2 p.m. Those in favor? Those against? The ayes have it. This honorable House now stands adjourned.